Northern Greece, 2006, Part 1. A famous Serbian Montenegrin hiker and primarily a great man, Krsto Žižić, or Žiža, as we who, thanks to him, saw and got to know so many beautiful mountain landscapes of the Balkans, used to call him, used to take a group to northern Greece each year, around mid-September. For who knows which reason, I managed for years not to go on this tour, but luckily in 2006 I organized myself sufficiently well as to join a large group of hikers who went on this trip that lasted for some 10 days. The tour included climbing to the highest peak of Mount Olympus, September vacationing on the beaches of Greece, and a one-day trip to Meteora monasteries, but the most important reason for the tour was the regular marking of the anniversary of the breach of the Macedonian or the Thessaloniki front from World War I, including a visit to Kaymakçalan, military cemetery Zeytinlik in Thessaloniki, and attending a ceremony at the World War I memorial in Polycastra. The first destination on our trip was Kaymakçalan. This is the highest peak of the mountain range Voras. This is what the Greeks call it. The Macedonians call it Nidje, with the altitude of 2,521 meters above sea level, and it is located at the very border between Greece and northern Macedonia, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. On the slopes of the mountain there are also terrains used for skiing during winter, which may be concluded by the existence of a ski lift. Thus, after a night's drive directly from Belgrade, early in the morning the coach brought us to the place where the ski lift begins and where the asphalt road ends. After a short break, the hikers started their ascent to Kaymakçalan on foot. The peak itself is within the border zone, and it is not envisaged for people to wander around just like that. So, to start with, before the trip, Žiža had to send a list of participants to the Greek army, which secures this section, and a couple of Greek military border guards accompanied the group heading for the peak. They actually followed the group in a small vehicle that had a cabin in the back. Since in the period before going to Kaymakçalan I wasn't very active as a hiker and had some health problems, I was actually very unfit. I did start on foot with the group along a very steep slope, but I soon gave up, and when the vehicle passed by me, I asked the Greek soldiers if, in addition to a couple of hikers who were already in the cabin, they could take me as well. This eventually turned out to be a great thing, because I was among the first visitors, which allowed me to see and take photos of some things without too many people in the picture. I was also first to get down into the charnel house, which was important as there were no crowds there. Kaymakçalan is the place where in 1916 there was a battle between the Serbian and the Bulgarian armies during World War I. This entire area was a part of the Thessaloniki or the Macedonian front, and in this sector the Bulgarians held the peak while the Serbs had the task to take it. Preparations for the battle started on the 12th of September, and the attack ensued on the 16th of September 1916. There was a lot of tug of war, but by the end of the month and with a high number of fatalities, the Serbs managed to win the battle. 90 years later, exactly on 16th of September, the vehicle brought a couple of us just under the peak itself, and that last segment had to be covered on foot, and I was again in a situation in which I was getting out of breath on account of the steep slope I was walking along. There, across the entire clearing covered only by grass, it is still possible to see remains of trenches, as well as rusted remains of barbed wire from the First World War, and that only reminded me of the events that reached their peak here in September 1916. As I've said, the task of the Serbian army was to conquer the peak held by the Bulgarian army. I felt almost ashamed because it was so difficult for me to go up the hill as a leisurely tourist, while my ancestors had to cover that same steep slope under a heavy fire of the Bulgarian artillery. The final conquest of the peak took place on the 30th of September, and it was a very emotional moment for the Serbian army, for at the time this was a border line between Greece and the Kingdom of Serbia, so the taking over of the peak, on whose other side was practically the territory of Serbia, symbolized the final beginning of homecoming, since in 1915, when faced with the attacks of the German and Austro-Hungarian forces, the entire army was compelled to leave the country in order not to capitulate. Today, at the very top, there is a small memorial chapel dedicated to St. Elijah. It is in a rather shabby condition, but it is not unusual, for many years have passed, many things have happened, and it is not in a suitable place for regular visits and maintenance. The fence around the plateau on which the chapel is built is made of the leftover artillery ammunition, as well as of intertwined barbed wire. When one enters the chapel itself, there is an impression of major dilapidation. The floor is damaged, and there is some wooden door placed over it, or at least this is what it looked like in 2006. In the sanctuary space, there was a table with different gifts. Somebody had lived there. There were some old wreaths, and the entire wall opposite the entrance was covered in icons. Still, one of the most valuable things that could be seen there is a white marble urn that is placed on the right-hand side from the entrance. This urn is where the heart of Archibald Rice, a great friend of the Serbian nation, used to be. Archibald Rice, born in 1875 and died in 1929, was a German-Swiss criminologist and forensic scientist, and he also used to be a professor at the University of Lausanne. In 1914, he came to Serbia at the invitation of the Serbian government in order to investigate the crimes of the Austro-Hungarian army over civilian population. He came, fell in love with Serbia and the Serbs, and stayed with them until his death in Belgrade in 1929. At his expressed desire, his heart was placed in an urn and brought here to Kajmakčalan, while his body was buried at the Topčider Cemetery in Belgrade. Over time, the heart from the urn disappeared, and although there are several different stories and suppositions as to what really happened to it, the most probable version is that it disappeared during the Second World War, when this area was again taken by the Bulgarian army. The urn, however, did survive, and there is an engraving on it. Here, in this urn, on top of Kaymakchalan, a heart of gold sleeps, a friend of Serbs from the direst days, a hero of fairness, truth, and justice. Rise the Swiss, may he rest in glory. There is also an engraving of the date of his death, the 8th of August, 1929. When you leave the chapel, you can see a stone cuboid down the slope surrounded by small pillars. This is where the charnel house of the Serbian soldiers who were killed in Kaymakchalan is. That is, a part of the remains has been transferred to Thessaloniki, to the military cemetery in Zeytinlik, while the rest has been collected here. At the stone plateau surrounding the cuboid, there is a lid-covered square entrance into the charnel house, and when you remove that lid, it is possible to go down metal ladder. As I've mentioned, I was the first to reach the charnel house with another hiker, so the two of us removed the lid, and one after the other went down. The experience is specific, not only because of the place itself and its nature, but also because of the awareness that remains of the heroic ancestors of my nation are placed there. The Battle of Kaymakchalan is considered in our collective memory as one of the most glorious victories won by the Serbian army. Still, the Serbian soldiers had to wait for the final return to their homeland and their homes for 2 more years, because the Macedonian front was only breached in September 1918. We who came here as tourists gathered around the coach a little while later, and then were taken to a place on the coast where we stayed for a week. Serious hikers used this time to climb Mount Olympus, while I went with my friends for nice walks around some nearby flat parts of Greece. Still, this was also an opportunity to go for a one-day visit to the famous Meteora, the monasteries. The Meteora is named for a group of monasteries in the north of Greece, in the region of Thessaly. Near the place Kalambaka, there is a very unusual geological formation where huge rocks, like columns, rise from the surrounding vegetation and provide for a link between the flatlands and the mountain massif. In the 11th century, first hermits started to live in caves that may be found within this formation, and then, over time, proper monasteries were built on their tops. For a long period of time, the monasteries were accessible only by rope ladders or baskets that could be pulled up into the monasteries when not used, which would ensure their complete inaccessibility and privacy. Today, all of the monasteries may be reached by an asphalt road, or rather, it is possible to get to some of them, and then it is necessary to follow the paths and steps carved into the rocks until reaching the entrance. In the 15th and the 16th centuries, there used to be 24 active monasteries here, but this number fell to only 4 in the second half of the 20th century. Nowadays, there are 6 active monasteries: St. Stephen's Monasteries, Agios Stephanos, Holy Trinity Monasteries, Hagia Triada, Monastery of Roussanou or St. Barbara, Monastery of Varlam, Monastery of Great Meteorion, Megalo Meteoro, and Monastery of St. Nicholas, Agios Nikolaos. Some are male and some are female. The monasteries are very traditional, which means that when one wants to visit them, it is necessary to be decently dressed and in line with the tradition. In other words, no bare arms and legs, but rather long trousers or longer skirts and longer sleeves. For those who forget to bring with them appropriate clothing, the monasteries provide pieces of clothes that may be borrowed for the occasion. It is also important to bear in mind that not all the monasteries are open every day and during the entire day. When one plans to visit, it is advisable to check the opening hours of the monasteries in order to make a selection. But if there is time, it would also be nice to stay at one of the numerous hotels in Kalambaka and visit the monasteries over a couple of days.